Hey Internet friends! The majority of the coverage of the events taking place in Venezuela, on the American media at least, has been framed as a cautionary tale about the dangers of socialism, resulting in a great deal of the public sentiment being a non-committal shrug, accompanied by an apathetic dismissal sounding something like, well, that's socialism for you. Don't get me wrong, I'm no socialist, but could something else be at play here? In addition to socialism, perhaps other factors that are contributing to Venezuela's economic and political crisis that has been brewing for quite some time? How could a country so rich in natural resources, home of the largest oil reserves in the world, find itself in such a crisis? The Venezuela of today has a population as diverse as its geography, but a good portion of that population has united in protesting the country's high rate of inflation, alongside a scarcity of staple products. They don't want the reputation of living in the country with the highest homicide rates in the world. They want a radical change in their government, and while Venezuelans are pointing at their government is pointing at foreign infiltrators and placing a great deal of blame on them for the disruption. So who's right? Who's wrong? And is it really that simple? The old divide and conquer has been effective in the past, so why would those waging economic warfare on Venezuela cease to utilize it? In these videos, it's hard for me to explain that just because one side is wrong doesn't make the other right, especially in the case of Venezuela, where it's apparent to me that the government is corrupt, but also the protests are infiltrated, and good people are caught up in this. Everyone wants to choose a side. The mainstream media is pushing us to choose a side. I know which side they're wanting us to lean towards, but why don't we choose the side of the people, the citizens? In this video, I'm going to cover some of the oddities about present and past Venezuela. We'll say hello to some familiar players, and hopefully, I'll share with you what the media won't tell you about Venezuela, so you can gain a new perspective, or not. Let's begin. Historically, the value of the Venezuelan dollar has been contingent on its one-trick pony economy, the oil industry. When the Middle East began to export oil in the 1950s, there was more supply than there was demand, and oil prices fell, which affected the economies of all oil-producing nations. So they met up to chit-chat and strategize in 1960, forming what is now OPEC, which was originally created to regulate the supply of oil so the prices would shoot back up and everybody would be happy. And even though oil prices continued to fall throughout the 1970s, war changed all of that. The 1973 Arab-Israeli War led to Arab oil trading companies cutting off trade with the United States and other nations who supported Israel, which was good for Venezuela because their oil prices shot up. But OPEC members didn't keep their original promise. They didn't continue to regulate their supply of oil, and thus the market was flooded with supply, but not enough demand, meaning there were some broke folks in Venezuela when Hugo Chavez came to power. Chavez had some economic success when the new oil demand came from India and China, but he funded social programs with that oil money, which proved to be beneficial in the short term, but not the long term. Overspending meant he borrowed heavily, and as a Catholic who at one time intended to become a priest, he described Jesus as a communist, which I know seems totally off topic, but I'm coming back around. In 2006, Venezuela's relations with the United States and Israel soured as Chavez outspokenly cursed Israel. A couple of years later, during the Israel-Gaza conflict, Venezuela broke all diplomatic ties with Israel, condemning its actions. But here's the real kicker. Venezuelan Foreign Minister Nicolas Maduro, have you heard of him? In 2009, he met with the Palestinian National Authority to establish formal diplomatic relations. And at a rally a year later, Chavez alleged that Israel was financing the Venezuelan opposition. There were even groups of Israeli terrorists of the Mossad who he said were trying to kill him. But the response was that these allegations and accusations were baseless. But that wasn't enough for Chavez. He called Israel a terrorist and murderous state, and he cursed it by saying, "I take this opportunity to condemn again from the bottom of my soul and my guts the state of Israel."
Desde el fondo de mi alma y de mis vísceras al Estado de Israel. Maldito seas, Estado de Israel. Maldito sea. Terroristas y asesinos.
Not 1 year later, the United States imposed sanctions against 7 companies, including Venezuela's state oil company, for supporting Iran in the energy sector. And in 2012, in what they said was an attempt to curb the violent crime rates, Venezuela banned private gun ownership. Chavez would never be able to see the full effect of that because he died of cancer at age 58 in 2013. Maduro became his successor, imposing mandatory visas for all U.S. citizens visiting the country. This took place in March of 2015, and curiously, he added that former U.S. President George W. Bush and former Vice President Dick Cheney and Marco Rubio would be denied visas into the country, labeling Bush and Cheney as terrorists. Maduro stated that the travel bans targeted those who violated human rights and bombed villages in Iraq, Syria, and Vietnam. Later that month, Obama declared Venezuela a national security threat, with the White House saying that the new set of targeted sanctions excluded the Venezuelan people and any trade relations with the nation, and are instead specifically aimed at government officials the U.S. accuses of violating human rights. So keep in mind that during this time, Obama was thawing relations with Cuba. Maduro responded on national television, saying that Obama personally decided to take on the task of defeating his government and intervening in Venezuela to control it. Maduro continued to practice some of the same economic strategies as Chavez, creating a climate of corruption where private businesses could not flourish. Not in a country with the highest inflation rates in the world. Oil prices continued to fall. Pieces of paper and coins mean very little if there's nothing to buy from the grocery shelves. And predictably, crime increased, even though Maduro was said to have pledged $47 million towards new disarmament centers. People are angry. They're angry over failed socialist policies instituted by a socialist regime that's seeming more and more like a totalitarian regime as the days pass. And the defenseless population, freshly unarmed, can only get lost in the fray of protest violence as their disconnected ruler dances on TV. So is this a cautionary tale of socialism? Or is this a cautionary tale of what happens when you allow the government to take away your right to defend yourself? Was this the plan for quite some time by those who had their eyes set on Venezuela's natural resources? I know I mentioned Israel earlier, but I don't think that Zionists are the only faction at play here. When you consider that we're talking Latin America under Jesuit rule, I personally think that Rome never fell. The Roman Empire persists even today. Mossad, Jesuits, bankers, they all want a piece of Venezuela. And it looks like the Venezuelan government, despite all its faults, has rejected becoming a member of the Bank of International Settlements. And you know what that means. Look at all the other countries who aren't members. Look what happened to them. Disarming the population, making them line up for a limited supply of food and basic medicine, that's a really effective way to control people. Like I said at the start, good people are caught up in this, and they're furious with Goldman Sachs for buying the country's government bonds last week, which supports the Maduro government and the people's starvation. This isn't just socialism. This is economic warfare. This is destabilizing an economy, and it's been going on for quite some time. And that's what the media won't tell you about Venezuela. So let me know what you think. I look forward to reading your comments. Please be sure to subscribe, click the little bell button so you get notifications when I upload, and consider supporting my channel on Patreon. And as always, thank you for watching.